once a government takes a power, it will never give it back voluntarily. That is a rule of political science. And the other rule is that every power they take will ultimately be abused to the maximum extent possible.
Good afternoon, sir. Well, last month, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. We caught up to him during a campaign trip in Washington. Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
You've talked pretty directly about COVID and the policies around that, and how the subterfuge or the guise of a pandemic gave kind of a carte blanche to take some of our Bill of Rights and just set it aside, if not just completely put it in the shredder. And the people feel trapped in that. I think they feel like their opinions are lost. Again, what do we do?
And they should. I mean, we should be alarmed, because although a lot of those mandates have now been lifted, the government has never said, we'll never do it again. They're just waiting for the next pandemic or next terrorist attack or the next war or, civil unrest. And the framers of the Constitution did not put a pandemic exception in the Constitution. The Constitution was written, they wrote it for hard times. They wrote it no matter what. American people get to keep these. You can't suspend the Constitution for any reason. It doesn't matter if the country's falling apart. You can't do it. It doesn't matter if people are dying. You can't do it. The rights are, there was a generation in 1776 who put their lives, their fortunes, their reputations on the line, and their livelihoods, their property, in order to give us those Bill of Rights. You can't take those away on a pretext. So I got censored for saying things like the vaccine will not prevent transmission. I knew that in May of 2020 because I saw the monkey studies, and it didn't prevent transmission in the monkey studies, so I knew it wasn't going to prevent transmission in humans. But I'm a big boy. I can take care of myself. I'm not complaining. But there were people who were the mothers of people, children who were getting injured. There were people who got injured, who lost children, who lost loved ones, adults, whatever. And they were evicted from the social media platforms for simply telling their stories. There were doctors who were treating people successfully with pre-licensed medications, with off-the-shelf medicines, who were forbidden from saying that, forbidden from telling people how to take care of themselves. And so, the harm that they did to public health in this country was enormous. So they started with constricting our freedom of speech. Then they went after the other part, the second leg of the First Amendment, which was freedom of worship. They closed every church in this country, except with a few brave, ministers and preachers who stood up to them, but every church in this country for a year, with no scientific citation, no democratic process, no notice and comment rulemaking, public hearings, environmental impact statements, all the things that are required when the government passes a rule that's going to impact people broadly. None of that was done. It was just one unelected bureaucrat who's been there for 50 years, telling everybody one week masks don't work, and the next week everybody put them on. You have no choice. You have to lock down. You have to social. They went after the third leg of the First Amendment, which is freedom of assembly, and said we all had to social distance. We had to lock ourselves up and social distance. And once a government takes a power, it will never give it back voluntarily. So now that is a retinue of countermeasures that will be unraveled and rolled out anytime that anybody can declare an emergency for any reason, whether it's a disease or a war or a terrorist event, and it's very, very frightening.
Well, we can't accept that. We can't just concede the field, because history. Most of our listeners, I'm sure, don't have the grasp of history you do, but there really isn't much suggestion in human history that the government will relinquish power once they take it.
That is a rule of political science. And the other rule is that every power they take will ultimately be abused to the maximum extent possible. And so today, there's all these new technologies that are descending on us, the AI technologies, which are terrifying. The surveillance technologies, facial recognition technology, the iris recognition, the satellite surveillance. There's going to be very soon 415,000 low altitude satellites that will be looking at every square inch of the Earth 24 hours a day. The GPS in your watch, your phone, your automobile, that allows the government to track you all the time. Digital currencies, which are now coming in, which will allow them to cut off your currency without any trial or charges being filed. We need to be building up and fortifying our democratic institutions to resist the potential malevolent use of this, this turnkey totalitarianism that comes from that technology. That technology is going to give totalitarian elements within our society ultimate control over everything. And the only way that we can resist that is if we strengthen our democratic institutions, and yet we're ripping them apart. We're discarding them, and we're saying, the Constitution is good, but only when it's convenient. And that's not what the Constitution was written for. It was written for the times when it's inconvenient.
Let's imagine it's Thanksgiving 2024 and you have been elected president. How do you fill a cabinet and an administration with, you stand as an outlier right now amongst the community that you've spent most of your life serving in. So how do you cobble together the people to support you and enact the kind of worldview you're describing?
I think about that a lot, and I think about specific people that I want in my cabinet. And I wanted, to be like what Lincoln did, which is he included in his cabinet, which was probably the most effective in American history, a team of rivals, of people who didn't agree with him, of people that, were more, in some cases, more intellectually adept, had better, had their own loyal political constituencies, that had talents that he didn't have, and he wanted to bring all of those, kind of the best people together, who were really results-oriented to try to restore the country. And I think that's what we need today. We need people who are Republican and Democrat and independent, who are high-minded people, who are honest and have integrity, and who will work to unravel the capture of our public agencies and put this country back on the rail again.
So you have the hope that those people still exist and we can have that kind of work together?
I know they exist. I mean, I run into them every day.
Well, you've had the courage of late to comment that you thought the CIA was involved in the assassination of your uncle. And we have recently heard the Durham report come out that suggests malevolence in the FBI at the highest levels, impacting government again. The American people, I think rightly, have cratered trust in organizations from the CDC to the FBI, or we name it. So how do we restore that? How do we find the people willing to live with transparency and forthrightness so that the American people can rally again around leadership in this nation?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just personnel. That policy at some level is picking the right personnel, but we need to change the institutions in fundamental ways, so that we remove the incentives that have put that on that, that kind of trajectory.
How do we do that?
Well, each one of them is different. I mean, if you take the public health agencies, those agencies have all of these really almost shocking financial entanglements with the pharmaceutical industry. So FDA gets half its budget from pharma. That's wrong. NIH, if you're a scientist working for NIH and you work on a product that then makes it to market, you can then collect royalties on $150,000 a year for the rest of your life. The mercantile impulses from those kind of conflicts is, of course, going to subsume and overwhelm the regulatory function of those agencies. And so we need to those are just clear conflicts that should not exist. Another kind of systemic thing that we need to do is to lengthen the amount of time that if you work for one of these agencies, then you can go work for the regulated industry. You know, right now it's 1 year, let's make that 5 years. Because what they do, of course, is they do favors for the industry that, you know, that they're about to join. You know, they're seeing their retirement come, and they start doling out favors for the companies that they want to go work for. So those agencies, it's pretty clear we need to end the financial entanglements with the industry. Each agency has its own incentive system.
I'm going to take a phrase away from this, mercantile impulses. In my peer group, we just call that greed.
Yeah,
and I think
that's a short word for it.
I think the American people are tired of watching the greed that is replicated. And as you so eloquently pointed out, it's happened generation after generation. Until at this point, I think we see our systems collapsing. And you have had the courage to identify that, from Dr. Fauci with the CDC, to our intelligence communities, to our immigration policies. You know, you founded the Children's Health Defense to stand up on behalf of children. Lord knows they need that right now. They're being assaulted on almost every front. The family's under attack. I want to read a quote. I'm sure it's familiar to you, but maybe not to all of our listeners. Few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their peers, the censure of their colleagues, or the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. I'm sure you know that was your father. And you seem to be modeling that in the face of a peer group that I'm sure isn't celebrating you. But thank you for the courage to tell the truth and to lead with a perspective that does turn on a light of hope. And I pray that there are many who rally around that message to stand up for our Bill of Rights, for our heritage of a nation of faith and values that have brought light to the world. You know, I believe America has been a force for good far more than we have been a destructive force. And there is much to be proud of in our nation and our history, in spite of some rather dark chapters and failures. And I think you're trying to remind Americans of that. If you could leave us with a message, what would you say to the American people that are tired of the greed and the hypocrisy and the self-interest that seem to dominate in so many places in Washington and beyond?
You know, what I would say is that we're not going to solve this problem if we revert into tribalism. That one of the things, the mechanisms that the elites use to make sure they can continue to exploit, our country, to strip mine our wealth and our assets, to poison our children, to commoditize our, human beings, and is to keep us fighting each other. And until we do that, we're not going to fight. We're not going to be able to effectively battle the forces of evil and darkness, the apocalyptical forces of ignorance and greed and tyranny that threaten everything that we value in this country.